Thanks. I'm particularly excited to be here because this is a group I've been interested in talking to for a while, and I have a lot of colleagues over in computer science. I'm going to talk to you today about a project that I co-lead, that I'm responsible for starting, but I am by no means responsible for executing. There's a cast of thousands, so I'm rather taking credit for the work of a lot of people, right? And we call our group the Human-Centered Systems for Sustainability Group, which translates to the acronym HISSL, which is really horrible. And if you can think of a better one, you win a prize. And basically, we got involved in this because we started looking at the issues of what I naively thought was human-home interaction. That is, how do we make homes more sustainable or living environments more sustainable? And very quickly, you discover that there's really two kinds of conversations going on in what I like to think of as the green building dialogue. The first is the sort of engineering, computer science one around smart homes and automated building systems and performance optimization. And you can think of this as something that looks at, as the resident, implies that the resident has to be an expert manager of this technological infrastructure. And the other discussion that's going on in the architectural and energy fields are energy simulations and comfort models and how the building itself performs with respect to these particular models. And this is really a conversation that the designers are undertaking with respect to the building capabilities itself. And it doesn't take a rocket scientist to see that, in fact, there's something missing here in this equation. My area of interest is human-computer interaction, and there is really not very much human in this mix. So our first starting question for this work was to say, well, what is it that needs to be green or smart? And there's a lot of money smarter people than me working on the area of building performance models and building envelopes. So there wasn't a lot of low-hanging fruit there, but there's a lot of low-hanging fruit that says, what about how people use their homes? Okay? So we're concentrating on the occupant as a user, as opposed to the building performance. And that means that we have to understand this whole field of what architects are just recently terming occupant behavior. We might think of as just user and context of use. And it means not only do we have to understand how they're doing it with the current homes that they have, but we also need to understand what the implications are of making technological interventions, because to date, those interventions have been remarkably unsuccessful. So we like to say that our mission is chasing the negawatt. Now, I wish I'd coined this phrase, but I didn't. It's an Amory Levin's phrase. But what is driving it is a couple of things. One is that there's now research in the field that shows with some relatively small changes in occupant behavior. So rather than large-scale, huge lifestyle changes of becoming a vegan, we're talking small changes in how you use your home. We can actually save between 10 to 30% of our energy footprint in our homes. That's a very large number, and it's a number that a lot of people aren't looking at yet. We don't have the faintest idea about water. I should emphasize that while a lot of our work has been around energy, we are very interested in water as well, but it's a much more open field. So generally in this talk, I'm going to discuss a little bit around what we mean by conservation and behavior change. Behavior change is a maybe. I'm not suggesting that we can affect it. And talk about, in particular, about a system that we've built to facilitate this, and two case studies of two houses that we've built, and try and offer you some insights into the affordances and the potentials and the dreadful pitfalls of doing this kind of research, because you have to do it in the field. So there's a part of this talk that is the be very afraid talk. And then if I have time, I'll do a quick discussion of one of our user studies, and often I don't. So there's basically in our group, three main thrusts currently to the type of research that we're undertaking. The first is what we call, rather than smart homes, this drive to aware homes and smart occupants. And so we're looking at in-home control and information systems and degrees of automation or sensing or what's appropriate, and all of that falls under that rubric. What comes out of this as well is a better computational models for the designers themselves. So rather than just giving them relatively coarse energy models or daylighting models or even comfort models, we'd like to understand how people actually use their spaces. And this is going to lead into what kinds of tools could we give designers that help them better play with this idea of occupant behavior early on in the process. And the third is to look at what is it that motivates humans rather than the imposition of technology. So our focus is very human-centered. Right? We want to understand how people think and what they do, and because we know that that's where we can make a difference. And that means that we have some serious work going on right now in looking at what might be patterns of behavior around energy use and impediments or facilitators to habit change. So of course there's many, many, many research questions around this, but here are some of the ones that we find ourselves facing. Okay, what is it that people are already doing that affords or impedes conservation in their home? Right, that says analysis of existing environments, but it should say analysis of how people are living in their existing environments. We're not actually analyzing the environments except to look at the field. Okay, you could have a very green home. If the light switches are poorly placed and you have to spend a lot of time turning them off, you probably won't. So we're looking at that kind of impediment, and that's my student Mariam Kashani. What kinds of appropriate interventions can we make? Right. Now, I'm a technologist, so I think of technological interventions. Some of our architects think about what kinds of wider design interventions can they make. Keep in mind that technology might be a window or a light switch. It isn't just computational. Big question. Can we have smarts, and where can they be? Humans are not happy with automation. What does this imply for home design? And recently, what are some of the privacy implications? If any of you have been listening to the smart meter dialogue, you will know that this is coming up in a big way. So what's in our toolbox? Well, the first one is, as alternative energies come to the fore as a consumer available device, and people put them on their homes, as soon as you put something that generates energy on your home, you have changed your home from a passive consumer to an actual control system, to something that's generating. We have fully wired or fully connected home systems that let us have all our devices and our appliances talking to each other. And we have the accompanying smart home and home automation systems that go with them. This is an old meter, but it was meant to be a smart meter. This is what's called a point of consumption device. This is a prototype device that lets you know at the point of consumption, in this case a tap, how much water you're using. We have network protocols that mean that now devices are being built that talk the same language. And they talk the same language as the smart meter. So now you can actually get a better idea of, maybe my washing machine shouldn't be run now because the grids just talked to it and told it that it's heavily loaded. Okay. We used to have, this is a relatively recent development, consumer level gadgets that you could put into Google or into Microsoft, but there was one called Microsoft Home that was supposed to link up to your energy use, and somehow the insights you derived from having this on your desktop would help you monitor your energy use and presumably change it. But interestingly enough, both Microsoft and Google have dropped these initiatives. As of June, we have mobile devices, which mean all of a sudden our access to this information space extends beyond just some fixed control unit in our house, and last but not least, we have social networking, and that opens up all the power of motivation and social norming that we know has been really effective in the past. So that's what we have. This is what consumers get. What you see here are some engineering style of displays and even some slightly more consumer accessible displays that give you an overview of your energy use. Right? And the one up on the left also tells you what you're producing. You'll be interested to know that this one up on the left, which comes from the first net zero home in Boulder, Colorado, is an improved design from the previous design. And so when people go to put these into homes, like when alternative energy people go in to put them into homes, the first thing they hear is that I do not want that in my home. Right? So these are analytical displays. There are a couple of consumer products that are now coming online, which are called in-home displays, and there's a lot of interest in in-home displays. This is the Black & Decker Power Meter, and this is the Onkyo, and the idea is that these just sit around in your house and they give you truly meaningful information about how much energy you've used overall. Again, none of these have proven to be particularly successful. So, we've done a fair amount of work looking at some of the behavioral psychology around this, more as a guideline than as an explanatory effect. The general thinking is that you need to make combinations of interventions. So you can't just say, fine, we're going to put awareness in your home. And by the way, BC Hydro was the first group to say that awareness is not enough. You can't just put awareness in your home that today you've used 56 cents worth. Right? So there's some combination of feedback, there's some combination of public and private commitment and goal tracking, there's some combination of carrots and sticks. So here's a reward, look, you've somehow achieved a goal, and individual and group. Awareness is not enough, right? We know that awareness is not enough. And that's a really big thing, because all of the displays that I've showed you today are premised on the fact that awareness will do it. What we really, really know, and we know this from all of our work that we do in human-computer interaction, is that technology doesn't help. And as soon as you start throwing extra devices at people, you just increase confusion and workload. Smart homes have failed spectacularly because the usability is terrible and because humans have a very uneasy relationship with automation, which was confirmed with us in our first home. People don't want a cockpit in their homes. They don't want to have to look up everything. Where you can put these really affects how usable they are. I'll show you some examples of mistakes we made in our first house that'll speak to that point. And interestingly, we're now really targeting on what we think of as malleable lifestyle factors. These lifestyle factors matter. And this is what we're starting to see. Now, we can't change age or income or gender or any of the big ones that people have identified as being these sort of fixed various. But a lot, especially now with the new devices that we've got, a lot of the things that cause people to act in a certain way are around effort and knowledge and habit and how much time it takes. And these, we think, we can target. So our working, here's my example about the programmable thermostat. One of the reasons technology doesn't work, as a matter of fact, I would say one of the big major reasons is that it's ill-suited to how we live. So programmable thermostats, it turns out, I was delighted, there's a paper that came out in August that warranted what I've been saying for years. It turns out that houses that have programmable thermostats use more energy than houses that don't have programmable thermostats. Now, the general thinking in the power community is that this is a usability problem. And that if they were only more usable, because they're all inconsistent and they're highly varied and they're very difficult to use and most people don't use them properly, and that if were that only solved, the problem would be solved. But I don't think that is the problem. I think it's more fundamental than that, and that is that it doesn't map to the way that we live. I could set my thermostat to go down at 11:30 each night because that's when I usually go to bed. But you know what? I have a daughter that plays elite soccer. I could be out of the house for 5 nights this week because it's just the way it ran out this week. And so I've just heated my house for 25 hours at 2 degrees higher than I need to. That's a substantial hit, and I didn't need to, but I'm not going to reprogram my thermostat. I actually, at home, I don't have a programmable thermostat. I have a little manual slider. So the assumptions about how we live our lives are really poor, and they are schedule-based, and we don't work that way. So our working principle is this. If the perceived cost of doing something is greater than the perceived effort and the perceived benefit of doing it, then people aren't likely to change. They're not likely to change even the small actions that they take. And the thing about cost is that it could be something other than money. It's quite likely to be time and effort, right? And our problem in BC is this. Resources are really cheap. Power is really cheap and water is free. So somehow we've got to increase the perceived benefit, and money's not enough. And technology is really effortful. So we really think that we have some traction here if we can reduce the effort of using it, right? And increase the perception and motivations. Perhaps we can affect a little bit more of habit change. Okay, so what have we done with this? Well, we started off thinking this was a question of human-home interaction. And so like the good engineers that we are and designers, we built a control system for a home. Right? And we worked very closely with a couple of local businesses who took care of all of this side of things. Right? So Day 4 Energy gave us panels, and we worked with Embedded Automation, who built a lot of the VerHub that you see there, which is all the control system. And we said, fine, we're going to build an integrated web-based system to the home that leverages familiar things like browsers, some people already know these, can be integrated with all the other tools that they use, like Google Calendars and everything else, so we're not asking them to do new stuff. Some of it is embedded in the home, some of it you can get on your laptop or on your regular computer, some of them you can get on your mobile phone, and some of it is this area of what we call informative art. That's actually a piece in the home that doesn't look like a display at all. And we call this part of it the Aware Living Interface System. So part of the Aware Living Interface System to start with is a fairly simple control interface. And I'm sorry the resolution isn't very good. But What you need to know about this control interface is that it's actually a hierarchical control. So we've mapped what we call these modes or presets. So we have an away mode and a home mode and maybe a party mode and a sleep mode. And these are all configured to put your house into the various energy using states that it should be in. So if you're away, you probably want to turn off your television. You probably want to turn off your set-top box and the power to your microwave, because all of those things have a big vampire draw. Right? You probably want to put your thermostat down maybe 3 degrees, turn lights off except for the outside one, etc. Whereas if you're going to sleep, you probably don't want to do all of that and lose some settings, but you may want to drop your temperature 2 degrees and only leave the outside light on, because otherwise your son comes home when it's in the dark and wakes everybody up trying to get in the house. So the point is, these are configurable. They're also ubiquitous. So it's a one-stop, like I can just hit a switch. I can hit a slider here, which means that I'm leveraging an action that people already do. We have a set of what we call dashboards, and there's quite a lot of detail below this in the system. I'm just giving you a top-level view. This sits on an embedded panel in the house, but it can also be found on your laptop. Right? It's just a web page. But there's a couple things I want you to notice about it. One is that we are exploring different ways of showing you what your energy use and your water use is. And what you can't see on the water one is it says things like you've used the equivalent of 2 bathtubs of water. So we're trying to put things into some contextual form. The other thing that's important to notice about this is that we have a bar here, and that's your personal goal. And that tracks your progress to a goal. So right now it's a pretty brain dead kind of goal. You can say things like, I want to use 5% less energy than I used last month or last week or whatever it is. It's quantitatively measured. We're exploring that. But it does mean that it just gives you a constant feedback reminder of how you're doing. And there's a reason to do this for social norming. Okay, this is a stub. We don't want to design a social network, but this is a placeholder for the social networking that's part of your existing social networking. So if you have a carpooling tab, we have a Facebook plugin that lets you compare progress to a goal. Because of course you can't compare the actual numbers. So there's a variety of things that you could put in here. We've got an active project going on in how people discuss conservation in social media, and we see this as a really interesting area to explore further. Anybody interested? Let me know. This is the first of the kitchen backsplashes that we built in North House, and this is an embedded display, and this one is showing you that you're producing a lot of energy, that you've pretty well achieved your energy production goal for the week. And I think that there's a lot of people on your social network. It doesn't mean that that's the data you have to map. We were just exploring it. But this was the first thing of saying your house itself can be a feedback device. Okay. And finally, we have a mobile interface. Right? So we have this running on a couple of platforms, so you can carry your home in a pocket. Now, what's the challenge with doing something like this? Well, you know, I'm an engineer and designer, computer scientist type rather than a theoretical one. And so we have to build it. And we have to prototype it, and you know, guess what happens when you start doing this kind of thing? You cannot prototype it in the lab. You have to go out and do it in the world. You can only go so far, so you have to actually build and install it in houses. All of a sudden, we are not just talking with the users, we are talking with this huge community of stakeholders of architects, builders, designers, planners, engineers, public utilities. Oh, notice who's last on the list? They usually don't come into the design dialogue till that stage in the list. So our first project was called North House. How many of you have heard of the Solar Decathlon? The Solar Decathlon is a biannual international competition put on by the US Department of Energy for net zero homes. It's held on the National Mall in Washington, D.C. Many, many teams submit prospectuses to be selected. They select 20 teams. And you go down there, you install this house, you design it, and then you go down there, you build it on the National Mall. It's standalone, right? You're connected to the grid only to monitor how much you use, and you're evaluated on 10 criteria. And it has to run for 2.5 weeks, and you have to, you know, do so many loads of laundry, have so many movie nights, have so many dinner parties. It has to actually run like a house. So the University of Waterloo School of Architecture were the architects. And the Ryerson University thermal engineers built a custom thermal system. And at SFU, my group was supposed to be the interaction designers. So we're already 5,000 kilometers apart. So we're having this design exercise across 5,000 kilometers, which was interesting in itself. We came fourth by a hair in the Solar Decathlon, so that's higher than any Canadian team has ever placed. We won quite a prestigious award for the system, which was really great. And we were highly distributed. So here's some pictures of North House. on the National Mall. So you can see that it's pretty much glass. It has these incredibly sophisticated external shades that track the sun and direct angles of the sunlight into the floor to make sure that heat is captured. This is the inside. Note the lack of color. This is just the inside lit with the embedded panel and the ambient display. And here are some of the things we discovered. So when we started this design exercise, we were at a meeting. And they were explaining to us in great detail this wonderful exterior shade control, right? Shades, how they were automated. And we said, well, what happens if someone wants to go sit by the window and read a book? You'll put the house in non-automatic mode. It won't be optimal. We better have a light on the interface that says the house is in manual mode. And they will have to, and I'm looking at these people going, are you serious? When was the last time you thought about your house that way? We had a real issue with controls for the shades because there was nowhere to put light switches, so there were no light switches because everything was run through the central panel. It was really clear to us that what was interesting is that the architects, it wasn't just the engineers, it was the architects, really hadn't thought about this, right? Hadn't thought about this context that would interact with automation. So that was one of the first big ones, okay? The second one was, they said to us, you can have any location you want for the centralized dashboard controller as long as it's above the kitchen counter. Now, right, it's a touchscreen. I invite you to think, anyone here have kids? I invite you to think about the complications of having your child make a peanut butter sandwich and turn off the lights. I asked them that question as well. They looked at me like, oh, well, it doesn't matter, it's only a design piece. This is what we started here. It's only a design piece. Okay, so, but we had to put it there. We couldn't put it anywhere else because the light from the windows was too much. So there's real issues about these very basic elements of where you put technology. Okay, similarly, we were told we could have any color at all we wanted in our informative art kitchen backsplash as long as it was white. And so you'll notice here that this is with the under cabinet lighting on, and there's quite a lot of natural light. You couldn't see it. So there are real design conflicts here that I don't want to trivialize as much as this was a design piece, right, that this comes up. So what did we learn from this process? We learned that there's really very little lingua franca between the design communities, even on a temporal basis, that many of these decisions are made at different points along the way, and the implications of them are not encountered until later, right? So it's quite fragmented. And the assumptions that are made around these, that hold around these decisions aren't questioned, and integration happens at the end, which is very fraught with compromise. But the foundational problem here is that we all have really different and often competing ideas of what an occupant is. And so this actually turns the design process on its ear a little bit. We had 66,000 plus people through North House during the solar decathlon. So we had a lot of opportunity to interview and talk to potential users. Huge issues around situated controls, whether the simplicity of a central control as opposed to the flexibility of a distributed control and the distributed complexity of it, and that's something we had to address. We also discovered that people didn't have the same model of energy use. Not only did person A have a different model of what energy use was from person B, but person A had a different model of energy use depending on what time of day it was or what query they were making. And as a visualization person, of course, I know this. So I'm looking at my hydro bill. I want to know how many kilowatt hours have I used. However, now I'm looking at all the lights that are left on, and I want to know how much does this relate to yesterday, right? Or I want to know how much this might cost me. There's so many, and people had quite widely varying models of what used a lot of energy. When I told one woman that her microwave uses more energy in a year just keeping its light on and its clock and its settings than it does to actually cook the food, she was flabbergasted. So nobody had any idea of vampire draw. It was quite interesting because you assume that the people that are coming to the solar decathlon are the ones that are really interested, so they would know. So context is king. Without exception, people were completely taken by the fact that they could have these simple one stop, one switch, or one button on their iPhone models that made it really easy for them to do that. And they produced all sorts of scenarios for where this would be really useful. Like it should be in an alarm clock by your bed. We hadn't thought about that. That's a really great idea, right? So we've got a lot of that. I think I've already convinced you that design aesthetics, and the architectural community say I shouldn't use aesthetics, but to heck with them, they're not here. Present competing goals. It's not that ours are better than theirs, but we'd better talk about them right at the beginning. Nobody was comfortable with the fact that the shades were so automated that it was going to affect the light in their house. Nobody, except the engineers, who were thrilled. And so there's huge design issues there. And the other point we got from North House, and this was actually a meta point for us as we went forward, is that people said, well, that's really cool and stuff, but you know, like they didn't look at it as a place where they might live. They didn't look at it as something where they would actually occupy it and get it dirty, get peanut butter on the counter. And so for us, its utility as a inquiry piece seemed to be a little bit limited. So in some spasm of insanity, we said, let's do this again, only let's do it differently. We came back to Vancouver at the end of October 2009. Called up the city and said, shall we do something? And on December 1st, 2009, we decided to build another house for the Olympics for the deadline of January 21st, 2010. So what we wanted to do then was we said, fine, we want a research test bed. We want it to be a technology showcase. We'd actually like to have people live in this. So that means it had to be accessible. It had to be used, right? It had to be demonstrable, and we had to be able to configure it. And we just cold called a ton of people, and they all said yes, much to my surprise. And we built what we call West House. Did any of you see it at the Olympics? So this is a laneway home, right? So we just took a small footprint home. Nothing that we're doing is restricted to a laneway home, but one of our partners was really interested in laneway homes. It was a chance to combine initiatives. On site at the Yaletown Live site at the Olympics. And you'll see that it presents as a much more conventional kind of home. Right? Looks just like home, and there's switches all the way through it, and thermostats. You don't have to ever even know that there's a computer system behind it. You can just turn lights off and on the same way that you ever do. If you want to use some of the higher order functions for the controls, you do need to use the control interface. This is our second version of the kitchen backsplash. This one shows, I got the order wrong all the time, electricity use, water use, gas use, and lights up cumulatively as you do it. I'm going to talk a little bit about what these informative art displays are supposed to be in a minute. We built this before we had the money. I really don't suggest you do that. It went up, the shell of it and everything went up in 8 hours. We had a very cool roof that came from a local company in Richmond. These are integrated solar panels. Now that's a 1 kilowatt array. That's one of the casualties we had when we actually went to build it. So it had solar power. And that whole, all of the heart of the house, the engineering, the heating, everything, the computer system, everything fits in there. Actually, the computing system runs in a thing that's about this big. And this is the part that I've been talking about, which is Alice. So that's just one of the embedded touch panels. So there's nothing particularly rocket science about this interface, which is just sliders. You can get back in. But there's some of the presets that I was talking about, and you can add more. Right? And these are, because they're in a web-based system, they're accessible from anywhere. I have to tell you a really funny story about someone that said something about the iPhone. Okay, so we had a lot of partners here. We wouldn't have to I'll talk about them at the Okay. So the city of Vancouver, part of the deal is that they loaned us a piece of land for 5 years. It's right near Trout Lake Community Center. And it's in a community garden, so we're working with the activists. And the idea is that we would move West House there, and it would become both a tenanted living lab, a technology research and demonstration space, and for outreach. And you'll note that we've lost something already. We lost the new roof because the city of Vancouver wouldn't permit it. So now we have solar panels on the roof and a solar thermal system on the roof. You don't see it in this because this is early in October. Okay. So the tenants moved in April 1st. We're still working on it. It took us 7 weeks to build this, raise the money, get the partners on side, get the commitment from the city of Vancouver to put it downtown in the Yale Town Live site and deliver it. I said 13 months. That's an old time. Okay, I still don't have a permit for the solar panels. And that's something that I'm going to get to in a bit. So the challenge for this kind of thing is not insubstantial. And I don't actually know of another living private residence, tenanted living lab research project like this in North America. We've had a huge amount of interest in this kind of approach, and it's not easy. We learned some things from having another 7,000 people through during the Olympics. One of the things we learned is that everybody was frantic about, they love these embedded kitchen backsplashes and other kinds of embedded displays and what we call these informative at a glance. The idea of these things is that they're supposed to be at a glance. They give you an idea of how you're doing. You don't have to look something up. You don't necessarily think about it. It's like a window giving you an idea of what the weather is outside, and people love them. Okay, they love them fully lit. Think about it. They like it best when it shows you at your worst consumption. Okay, I couldn't believe that. We were looking at each other going, duh, how did we miss that? Lesson number one, the mapping is not intuitive. You're going to have to check how you do it and how you balance this, right? Here's another one about this. Is actually, we learned about this from North House when everyone just loved the idea of a remote control for the house with the iPhone and the fact that you take it everywhere. But this woman said, well, you know, dear, that's lovely and I think it's really exciting, but we lose our TV remote control all the time. What happens if we lose this? So, you know, really, you think you got this. So we also learned very quickly that we need some more informative models around how people use it. That's what West House and North House were supposed to give us, but we're certainly not there yet. We know that presence and schedule aren't enough. There was a really active debate going on with our users about whether they wanted automated or not, but without a doubt, they all said that simple schedule base was not enough. One of the things that affect how they use energy, not surprisingly, they told us it's how much they knew about it and how busy they were, how likely they were able to pay attention to it because it fell off the side of the importance scale when they were trying to get their kids to school in the morning. So we need to start being quite sophisticated about how we model where people are using things and what they're doing and how we support it. They love the ambient displays, but the design space is completely unformed. We're doing a lot of work in this area, and that's one of the studies I've got. And one of the things that we're doing that actually speaks to some of these first 2 points here is that we're evolving these models of effort. Human knowledge and human effort in using these systems. Okay, what else did we learn? Automation is often really stupid. You introduce all these behavioral constraints. You have to put technological representation into it. In other words, show the state of it, it's context specific, and it has side effects. Doesn't mean that you can't use it. It does mean you have to be careful about it. And we really need to deal with these things as a system rather than dealing with them as piecemeal effects. This is a system. The ethnographic approach to this will tell you, of course, you have to look at it as a system. Technology is not a single piece, is not a single bunch of single widgets. Anyone can make a widget. It's integrated into everything we live. So we have to really look at reducing the amount of widgets and increasing the sense of integration, right? So that I think about it all operating together, and where we put it affects how useful it is. And so rather than these lovely big sophisticated displays, we may be just dealing with really small displays, but distributed ubiquitously throughout the home. Things like a small warning sign on your washing machine that says there's not a lot of water in the reservoir, which gives you the option to say, maybe I should run my washing machine later, as opposed to saying, okay, program in when you'd like your clothes done. You know, we think the first might be more encouraging than the last. Okay. So that means we need to think about design models from the human perspective around these technology factors. What's an appropriate automation and intelligence? Now here's a place where it might be appropriate. The BC Hydro engineers are really interested in looking at adaptive lighting. It turns out if we turn the lights on when we got up in the middle of the night to go to the bathroom, we've actually disturbed our circadian rhythms. And so that's a clear case where you might say, fine, when you get up in the middle of the night to go to the bathroom, maybe the lights only come on halfway, right, if you've been sleeping. So what do you have to do when you do that? Okay, well, we think that you have to look at what's the cost of being wrong. What about if you really did want the lights to go on because you didn't get your grant in time and you are getting up in the middle of the night to write it, right? Well, maybe it's easy to just hit it again and it goes on. But those have to be explicitly modeled, and that's what I meant about some of those effort models that we're building. And you have to look at the perceptual and cognitive factors. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the process of doing this kind of research. Everyone thinks the challenge is development, research and development, research and development. Well, we think the challenge is research and deployment, right? How the heck do you get these things out there? The inertia is overwhelming even when everybody has the best interests at heart. Collaboration is completely key. So in this particular case, you might see that this is pretty well the way that buildings get built, right? Okay, this is us. Forget a timeline. It's a nonlinear design flow. It's full of incorrect assumptions. We need to look at fluid design and rapid prototyping for some aspects of this, but that is very difficult to coordinate between diverse communities. And we start getting all of these incorrect assumptions. And when people have incomplete knowledge, they will default to the known. Right? So when the electrician is looking at your branch circuit power meter and going, gee, I'm not sure what this is here for, he won't install it correctly because he's busy, he's got a job to do. And he doesn't think to ask because he knows how to put wiring in houses, but he doesn't know this. And maybe because he's a tradesman, he hasn't been part of the dialogue from the beginning, right? So you're dealing with the kind of tight project management that is important for building sites and building planning. But you know, that doesn't support flexibility. Oh, by the way, who's missing? Do you know? Yeah. The issues of doing this kind of research, when you've got tenants and they're dealing with public outreach and the fact that people are coming in and changing things under the ground under them all the time. And you know, people are interested in West House, so they're coming around and peering in their windows because they don't understand that people live there. And there's this very delicate balance between all of this. This is a huge issue. So the human issues around how you affect this is really interesting, right? And we are learning this as we go. But if we go back to before the poor tenants actually get in there, there's a point I always make, and I'm in the middle of writing a report of this for the city of Vancouver, who have given us money and land and support and have not managed to give us permits, okay? By the way, we have a solar thermal system on the house for heating water. It's kind of like the one the mayor has on his house, which also is not permitted, right? Vancouver's got aggressive policies in place for the greenest city, but it doesn't have any processes in place to facilitate going through them, right? And when I say the rank and file are not on board, I don't mean the rank and file are somehow resistant and saying, well, to heck with you. But they just have their jobs to do. And they don't know how to do this stuff. And Vancouver just says, well, everything's an alternative solution. And then whose responsibility? So you get these overlap of responsibilities. They're not delineated. And you know what does this do? This deters the small innovators. Doesn't deter the UBC campus, which maybe has a very large thing. Although even in facilities, you guys have your challenges, right? But it deters the small innovators. It deters the people like me. Well, it doesn't deter me, but I'm stupid. It deters people like us who say, let's try this. And so suddenly you realize that we thought this was about human-home interaction, but it's not. It's about how bringing the human into the loop involves people at all stages of the process if we want to get this kind of research done, because if we don't, we'll wind up with more programmable thermostats, which are not successful. And really, if you think about it, prototyping is about rapid iteration of design solutions. You try something, it doesn't work very well, you do it again, right? Better, hopefully. Permitting is all about forestalling, contingency, assigning liability for risk, making sure that things don't go wrong. Those are completely antithetical. So somewhere in between, when you start thinking about a project like this, I have learned, you need to come forward with a proposal, not just for a project, but with a proposal that says, here are all the stakeholders we think are engaged, and here is how we think you should change many of your fundamental processes to enable this kind of research to go ahead, which is a really big nut to bite off. So the message to the field, to the practitioners in the field, to the people we work with who are professionals and not academics, is that research is iterative and tentative, and we need to have ways of exploring that and supporting that. Things change, we bring in new complications, we need a different kind of operational management to facilitate it, right? And we need strategies for when we're wrong. And it's not just us. How many people remember when the Olympic Village, the Olympic Village had water, they were collecting rainwater to feed their toilets, right? And it didn't work. And there was somewhat of a little media storm about, oh, isn't it awful? It's a failure, it doesn't work. Isn't that awful? And I thought, well, their toilets are still flushing the same way yours and mine are with drinking water. They failed, so what? They made a mistake, they have to do it again, but the expectations management of it was really poorly handled. We need to be able to go out and say there to our communities, and we have to engage with our communities to do this kind of work. We may be wrong, right? Get used to it. So what that means is we have to be able to foster prototypes as a key part of a sustainability policy that says we want to make changes to buildings and to architecture and to policies and planning. And so there has to be some way of mitigating these impacts and some way of building a public communication message, which is entirely not my thing, but I know that it needs to be there. So the message to researchers, which is a community I usually talk to, is get out in the sandbox. You can't do this in the lab. Most of the constraints that you imagine, even if you're an expert, I'm an expert in visualization. I crawled home after that woman said, I love it fully lit. Right? Thinking, how did I make that mistake, right? But there's tons of opportunities here, tons and tons. There's opportunities for ethnographers, there's opportunities for technologists, there's opportunities for psychologists, right? For looking at how we do this. And in fact, if we don't engage these communities, we're not doing the right thing. And the strategies for when we're wrong, it's not just that there's strategies for managing how we're wrong, they actually give us new models of design and new models of doing things, right? So you do, I particularly liked my slide before I corrected the typo because it used to say interaction models with effort and terror. I should have left it in. My particular scope is that, I'm looking at how you bring the human into the loop from the human-computer interaction perspective, so I'm trying to bring that into the larger community. When I talk to HCI researchers, there is a huge opportunity to bring this into the larger community in some meaningful ways, and people are really anxious to do this. Do you know what? I cold called all of our partners, and they all said yes. It wasn't like they said, go away, silly professor. Okay, so what are we looking at in the future? We have studies with John Robinson at UBC and the Greenest City Conversation Project looking at social media and personal motivation. And this is very, very beginning, right? But we're very interested in it. And I'm just putting together a study on using our system versus using standard programmable thermostats with some motivation structures built into our system with Fortis, who is the gas utility. I have a couple of students looking at understanding human home use and lifestyle factors that affect conservation. I have a PhD student who is looking at appropriate automation and smarts and reasoning models about activity in the home. We're thinking that we can change small actions. We're not actually wondering whether we're changing lifestyle behavior necessarily. So we're talking about really small changes. And we're just starting to look at water consumption models. This is a really quick study we were doing with some landscape photographs that kind of gave people feedback of how much water they were using. Okay, talk about competing models. Some people thought this meant that they used a lot of water, and some people thought that there was a lot of water left over. So they liked it very much. It just didn't mean the same thing to everybody. So you have to be really careful about the mapping. So that's a huge space to be able to play in. And people like these because they don't have to necessarily, A, they don't have to integrate the cockpit of the home, and B, they think that it gives them some sort of easy feedback. Very unformed design space. We have a ton of partners. I'm sure I've forgotten some. And we have more coming on all the time. I also have funding from the Grand Network of Centres of Excellence, BC Hydropower, Smart City of Vancouver, Fortis BC. I know there's others, but that's the main funders. And I play with a lot of people So I will close here and say, if anyone has any questions, happy to take them. This is how you find us. We welcome people coming to talk to us. So, thank you.
I'm going to jump in. So my name is Lynn, I'm at Slice, and I spent 2 years doing an ethnographic project in 2 eco-villages, looking at their negotiations around their information technology use and their values around sustainability, and a lot of what you said around the policies and town, city permitting and all of that ring quite true to these very motivated people who want to change and do. They see themselves, both communities, as experimental living labs. So when you say we're the only ones, well, they're not the technologists, but they are trying all of these really innovative things in their home building and their site design. And one community is doing it by going through the permitting process. The other one chose a place to live where they wouldn't have to worry about it so much. It's interesting how that's developed.
Right. When I said we're the only living lab, I meant with respect to the kind of research that we're doing around technological interventions and the alternative energies, but at the sort of individual person in the home space, there are certainly communities, I live in a community on Gambier Island sometimes, and I got into all of this because I have a solar house.
Right. They're totally so motivated and have changed their lifestyles and all of these drastic things, but these constant battles with the bureaucracy, well, it's not, they try to go into it without thinking of it as a battle, but it just takes so long to try and do innovative things. So it's all of those larger level policies that then influence what they can actually do on the ground in their own homes. And Tad Hirsch's work with water, Tad Hirsch from Intel, and he was working in New Mexico and did an ethnographically informed thing, and again found like HCI, we need to engage with policy because much of what we're learning here actually implicates that. So I'm thrilled to see that that's, it's disappointing, but also, to have more voices in that mix. And then in terms of the people who are living there in the homes now, what's your interaction with the people living in West House?
So the interaction that we worked out, I should, by the way, how can I do this in a diplomatic way, say that I've got to give a huge shout out to SFU, because there is no other university in the country that I know of, and I've been at several, that I could have turned this around with this quickly. They put their entire legal, ethics, executive, fundraising at our disposal to make this happen, which was really great. So we have a contract with the tenants that says there's a certain amount of research access we get for interviews and tracking of data. Now the kind of data that we are tracking is their energy use data by circuit, which their energy use data is already tracked, right? So they don't care about that. And the way they use the technology. So we don't have cameras. We don't have anything like that. We're still playing methodologically with how do we get that quick, oh my God, this is driving me crazy thing, which right now we're getting through texts. Here's another thing. So, gee, we really like the kitchen backsplash, but at nighttime it's really bright. Can you mute it? So there's some sensing and adaptivity that has to come in. There is a certain amount of public open house time, 2 visits a month, one of which can be public, in which we actually staff and the city staffs and we clean, and one of which is sort of what we call targeted visits for technology outreach. We've been having real issues with actually not our technology at all, with just various things about the house and the septic systems and a variety of things that it's been a bit of a rocky start. The tenants were really, at the beginning there was a huge amount of interest. There still is, but now we have people contacting us rather than going there because we basically put a fence around and put big signs that said private property, right? Yeah. So it's an evolving discussion about what you can do, and it turns out that the kind of data capture that traditional HCI people and computer scientists think about, that's actually not the issue. Because we're not asking for, a lot of the smart homes that you see are for assisted living. And so when they do research in them, and they have a hard time getting them, they're using cameras. They need to see if an elderly person has fallen down, and we're not We will be putting in sensors to detect presence, like are you in the kitchen? Are you in the living room kind of thing? But we're not dealing with any kind of data in that sense that could be construed as highly, personal. So right now what we have is we have the systems, have had the systems turned off so that they just get used to living in the house as a regular house. And the goal of the first year is to say, what is it about the technology that's in there that really sucks? Because I firmly believe that the first set of investigations we need to do around these kinds of design interventions is to eliminate the awful. And even when we've been really reasoned about what we're doing, we know that there are a variety of mistakes that have been made, and we want to make sure that we eliminate those. So the goal then for the second and third year, and it's not clear whether it'll be the same tenants or not, originally we thought not, is to look at what's the difference when people live with it and don't live with it. And that doesn't necessarily mean that suddenly they've reduced their footprint a huge amount, right? It may just mean that what we hear is, gee, it's a lot easier for us to do it this way. So we can look and see, how do they use the systems? Do we need to do things like actually make the interface invisible and take it away? So instead of an embedded panel, there's just a light switch, right? All these kinds of things. How do we do the architecture? So it's a work in progress. I mean that in the most painful way. We had a lot of text. We do a lot of text back and forth. And we'll be starting our in-depth interviews with them around lifestyle factors when I get back from Boston at the beginning of November.
Okay, so this is just a close follow-on. Do they have kind of a motivating task? Are they supposed to conserve energy?
Nope.
Are they personally motivated?
Nope. And actually, we had a lot of people, when we put out the call to live in Westhouse, we had a lot of people that said, I'm absolutely the very best conserver. I have done everything. I don't breathe if it uses energy. and I felt so terrible at saying to these people, then you're the pessimal subject. Right? Our ideal tenant would have been the couple that had just downsized from the 5,000 square foot house in Shaughnessy and drove a big Cadillac and because that's the target. No, the target audience is people like me. I don't know about you, but I live in a dented old 85-year-old house, and if I'm up on the third floor exhausted and I know the lights are on and the computer's on in my office 2 stories down, I have all of the good intentions of the world of getting down there. The next morning I wake up and I go, didn't make it. That's the audience. So no, they're not supposed, they're motivating. And keep in mind that what we're trying to do right now is not look at, have we affected behavior change? Because you can really only, as social scientists, that you can only affect behavior, you can only measure behavior change on the scale of a population and the timeline of half a generation. I don't want to make any false claims here. But what we'd like to do is say, do we have a bigger version of a programmable thermostat or not? So first, let's get over that technological hurdle and see. And the fact that we've had such amazing, absolutely unanimous response to the embedded kinds of displays and the informative art displays suggests that there's some very interesting design space there to provide people a non-traditional but still useful artifact that might convey information. Yes?
So as I mentioned before the talk, I work for the residential community here at UBC. And we're really starting to think about some of the things we've been working on for a while, but we come at this entirely from a multifamily perspective. And so multifamily homes are supposed to be part of the solution.
Right.
Thinking about it in terms of control systems, I guess 2 things come to mind from your talk. One, or a question for you actually, one is have you thought about this stuff in the context of an apartment building? Where you
As a matter of fact,
common areas?
so I should have worn my t-shirt that says I'm never building another house. The next stage of our research from the system deployment side is going to be retrofits, completely retrofits. And actually one of the questions around that is, what's the minimum size of a retrofit that you could do? Like the little, make my house more energy usable in a box with embedded automation. And one of the technologies that affords that is that the companies we work with are starting to have a lot of these little wirelessly, like Zigbee wirelessly connectable devices, which means we don't have to go cutting huge holes into things. So yes, we have thought about apartments. We have thought about rental versus own. We have thought about multifamily. one of the things we are hearing about from families is, how the heck can I make my kids turn the lights on? We've heard that in our, yeah, like, please, please. We have an associated study going on. One of the things that I am really annoyed about is, like, I get my hydro bill, even if I get it electronically, and I'm going, okay, that was like 6 weeks ago. Why did I use that much energy? There's absolutely nothing to say that we can't get that energy feed to come into our Google Calendars. Why not? Then I can at least see, you know, oh yeah, I was working at home last week. No wonder I used more energy. So that kind of integration, part of that conversation when we've been doing this, the first part of this study has been, well, how do you allocate responsibility for using energy to various members of the family or various units in the building? I was really hoping, and the city had absolutely no problems with this, to be able to do some extensive interviews of the tenants in the Net Zero building in the Olympic Village, and that was originally part of our plan. But they are not a happy bunch right now, right? They're using more energy, they're getting much higher energy bills from their district energy management system, so it's not a good idea, but I think we'll probably go do it in about a year. So yes, we are thinking really hard about that, and if you're interested in talking to us about some of this stuff we want to do, we'd be really interested.
Well, and I'll just close with 2 comments. That too is, so we're closely associated now with John Robinson.
Oh yeah, I'm with John on the GCCP project.
I have your email because I think you're working on the sorts of exact things we're interested in. But in terms of multifamily, I think 2 interesting opportunities. One is that you have the issue of hot water, natural gas often shared, you know, so they're not paid for by the individual residents, but there may be a way of turning that around so that you engage all the residents on the building consumption, engage the strata councils that manage those systems. It's like a building management thing. The second thing, and just an idea, I think there's a lot of, you know, engaging people socially or getting neighbors involved in conflict.
So I want to tell you.
Sorry, just to.
Sorry, excuse me, I didn't mean to.
The finish is I think, you know, there's this idea, and I think it's true to some extent, that ironically, you know, apartment buildings alienate. You know, if you live in a neighborhood in a single-family home, you may feel more part of the neighborhood than you do within your own building. I think there might be an opportunity to turn that completely around and talk about building level goals.
Let me, yeah. So here's my motivating insight for all of this, because I gave a talk at AT&T Bell Labs, and they said, you know what? It's all about money. I said, it's not. So in the 1980s, they rolled out the Blue Box program in Canada. Now, I grew up with a family where my father was an engineer. He never wasted anything, and we used to go off to the recycling depot in our local town and throw bottles and get the catharsis of breaking things and all of that. But, you know, like, my friends all thought we were wacko. Right? That was something that nobody else did. But in the 1980s, when they rolled out the Blue Box program, they rolled it out in Kitchener-Waterloo, which is a very conservative area, and they said, we think that people, the uptake's going to be slow. You know, people will have to separate their garbage, it's kind of not aesthetic, it takes extra time, and there was no motivation, there was no financial incentive whatsoever, if you remember. And they rolled it out, and the uptake was so far beyond what they anticipated, right? Because people wanted to do things, and I think they had misjudged the pain point. I have this informal working metric of a pain point. Where's the pain point? Where can you reduce it? And the pain point wasn't sorting the garbage, it was taking it to the depot.
Well, isn't it part of that too, seeing what you're doing?
Okay, so here, fast forward to now we have an artifact where I had a woman say to me, she said, you know, on my blog, I'm a passionate reuser. I don't buy anything with plastic. I never recycle anything because I either reuse it or she said, I never do that. I'm the only one on my block that doesn't put out a blue box, and my neighbors think I'm a terrible, terrible consumer. So there's social norming is important. You don't want social opprobrium. I want to give one last example to the ambient displays that kind of picks up on what you say about that a little bit, and that is that one of the comments we've had about these displays, these informative art displays, and we've tried a bunch of them. I've just shown you the few that are put in the houses, but we have studies going on with a whole bunch of different ones, and people said, you know what we really like about them? We really like the fact that they're attractive and they're informative, but they're not pejorative. And one person said, like, I'm really tired about hearing about all the whales dying. We didn't solicit that. That was not part of our questionnaire. That was we've heard that now, like, emerge from people just sort of responding to these kinds of displays enough that there's clearly something there. Negative narrative. Yeah. Which is sort of the social opprobrium of that I don't put out my blue box.
I mean, it's funny, as I worked with UBC from research and seeing say I've gone retail, I'm working with residents very closely, and I'm just surprised how often there's a defensiveness. You know, just me showing up in the room, oh, you're sustainability. I'm sustainability manager in my position. There's a kind of defensiveness, and it's sort of like, oh, he's about to shake his finger at me. You're a lucky bad. And I'm very sensitive to that, you know, and I think it's something we have to figure out. And I think a lot of people are starting to talk about that.
Yeah, no, it's certainly, this is the narrative now. It's, you know, and even designers are starting to talk about it. So how can you provide some sort of small, meaningful feedback? So designers talk about constant, meaningful practice, right? That's how you do things. You learn and you get better through constant, meaningful practice. So we need some kind of constant, meaningful feedback, but it doesn't have to be this big one. It doesn't have to be you've saved the planet, or the alternate, you've destroyed the planet.
Or you're going to set, you know, you have to suffer. Right? That's it. You know, you have to turn down the temperature, put on a sweater, do all these difficult.
Yeah, but I think people would actually do that if you. I'm not sure that's the pain point. I think the pain point is, God, I have to remember to turn it back up to do all this. Maybe, you know, maybe it's as simple as saying, not as simple, but here's one thing that I said to an architect who looked at me like I'm nuts. I said, well, maybe you should have places to hang sweaters in every room in the house. In my house, we use the doorknobs. So they're always on the floor, because, you know, so yeah, it's an integrated strategy. And we also need to stop thinking about technology as something that's computational. Because a window and a door and a light switch are also very primitive forms of technology. And so there's a use model there that needs to be more comprehensive, I think.
Yeah, look at the impact of also just having, you know, I mean, to me, what it seems like one of the benefits of this is that you have a public display that the public can just come and walk through and look at. Because I was thinking about, you know, hearing about, you know, in the States where this guy was trying to bring up this issue of toilets and how they need to be, we need to rethink them, and it's just like, oh, people don't want to go there. You don't mess with people's toilets, you know, you don't want to go there. And part of me kind of wonders if it's, you know, if you've ever used a biolet, you know, it's like they're actually unpleasant to use, but if someone has never used one and they've seen one, they might just kind of think,
well, that was really the motivation between going from something that was a design piece like North House, which is a beautiful design piece, it really is, right? But it's not something that sort of affords living, to something like West House. To really say, if we want people to walk through it and say immediately, oh yeah, I could live here.
The other thing looks more like work product. Yeah. Like it's beautiful, but you know.
Yeah. So, and there's nothing about it that has to be a small footprint. It could be a lot of other things, but we wanted people to say, well, I could live here. And I think that's one of the reasons why the things like the animated backsplashes or the embedded, you know, like the digital photographs that change with respect to water elicit a kind of a positive response, is that they're going, yeah, I could live with that. You know, that's not so far off from what I have. Whereas if it's an engineering display, you know, well, that's the kind of thing that I could expect to look up on my computer, but it's not clear that I want it around home. It's not that there isn't a place for those displays. There clearly is, and a lot of energy's gone into them. But just that that's not necessarily the sort of thing that fits into, that affords comfort and repose in your home. Yeah. Unless you're a geek like my husband.
So they were expecting that perhaps these backsplashes will be good for changing behavior, but then after the behavior is changed, you can turn it off.
Well, what has struck us right off the bat, I mean, we know this. So that backsplash, actually, we built in my lab with LED strings, which I had to buy from a wholesaler with cash in a parking lot in North Van, because they're not supposed to sell to private people. It was like a drug deal. With sheets of acrylic, like colored lighting gels and stuff. And what we'd really like to use, of course, is a more flexible display, so that the woman from Shaughnessy who came in and said, well, what about if I want Tom Thompson? And what about if I want Monet, right? Which makes a lot of sense. And so the really slippery slope there is that if you get a custom LED display, which we're going to certainly go and ask for. I mean, you know, no thing. But I don't want to fall into the temptation of this is a pixel display and now I can drive it like a computational display. We are driving it, but we're forced to think of it as an artifact rather than as a fully programmable display. And so we're going to play with this space of, you know, what's limited. So if someone says, okay, I've changed my behavior or things have gotten better like this, it's not even just I'm going to turn it off, but maybe I'll want to see different things. So, okay, I think we're pretty good. Look, it's never lit up. We're not using very much electricity. So now maybe what I want to see here is how well am I doing with respect to the neighborhood? So the fact is you could put different things in it, right? It means that your house becomes more fluid. And as soon as you put solar panels on, you want to say, well, how much am I producing? You know, so lots of different things you can do. So it's not clear that we know that, I mean, basically research is what you do when you don't know what you're doing. And so we're just, you know, this is a huge space. We're just starting to get a sense of it. So any ideas are welcome.
You could even, you know, if you have the display, even if you've changed your behavior and you basically see, you know, now you can have sort of display, this is where I started and look how awesome it is.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I actually have been looking in the past year at one of the most successful behavior change programs around, and that's Weight Watchers.
Yeah, I was just going to say, this is all sounding a lot like some of the diet systems that have, you know, mapped over time. And, yeah.
Yeah, and they do very small incremental habit change, right? And if you don't do so well one day, well, it's a very small slip. It's not a giant failure. You know, so they, and the same thing for smoking, right? How you sort of do this. So we can learn from that. As computer scientists, we tend not to learn from things like that, but we can learn from that. So.
Well, I'm afraid we have to exit.